Next presenter is going to talk about what can I do? Clergy experiences the housing crisis. Now, it doesn't matter if you can't have friends, doesn't matter what age you are. If you can't find a place to live, you're in trouble, right? So who cares, friends? And okay, Katie's going to take us on a wild adventure. Katie, for the next 2.5 hours, we're in your hands. Okay.
I'll get you to join me in a little bit of a breath. I'll start off my presentation by stating the most obvious part of this presentation. Canada has a housing crisis. And you can see my fun little comic here about perhaps we're investing in treat houses, but we're all in a general consensus here. The Canadian banks, our real estate agencies, journalists, financial advisors, and more agree that this is the case that Canada is looking at. Even the Canadian government has an entire page dedicated to how they are handling the housing crisis, and every single political party has a current stance on the housing crisis, has spoke of it. And several proposed solutions and are working towards it, hopefully. Unfortunately, according to an article with projections from the Canadian Real Estate Association, Bank of Canada, and Statistics Canada by Reuters News Agency, I hate to be the bad news bear, but it looks like we're here for a little bit. We're going to be dealing with this ongoing. Now, almost 2 years ago, I personally was in the midst of searching for a calling to a ministry called appointment for all of us students in the room. And I was looking for that final student placement, as many of us had gone through recently. And I interviewed out of province and within, and it's very well known across Canada that we have and are experiencing a housing crisis. But I really saw the effects of this showing up in the communities I interviewed with. All but 2 search teams I'd spoken with had absolutely no idea where I would find housing. They were able to offer a little more than, oh, there's no housing or rentals available around here. It's really, really bad. The other 2 I spoke with had manses, one of which I am now serving in. There were 2 proposals, both received from Reverend Betsy Hogan, that were introduced at the Bermuda Nova Scotia Regional Council's regional AGM this past May. And the proposal was that, like many other faith groups in Canada, the United Church of Canada has always taken responsibility for housing their leaders during their ministry. And the proposal also spoke to the shift away from manses, which has been going on since 1974, specifically for us here in the United Church. And the proposal goes on to say that the cost of housing has skyrocketed. And the clergy of the United Church of Canada are experiencing an inability to enter the housing market, an inability to leave manses, and unable to accept calls in areas with expensive housing markets when they are moving from less expensive ones. They cannot accept non-manse calls at all due to the lack of equity they have from these situations. And congregations in turn struggle to call unless they have a manse or the financing for a higher salary or for a loan down payment. And the proposal called on the region to address the concern around clergy who may be called to these areas. They asked congregations to consult with pastoral relations to explore the ways to negotiate loan down payments. And it was passed that the region agreed to encourage congregations to explore this and to explore it with their pastoral relations liaison and their regional minister. The second proposal called on our general council to consider capital assistance in fulfilling housing. It was amended and passed to the general council for action this coming year. And as I sat there, surrounded by my colleagues at this meeting, my friends, I realized how huge the implications of this were for all of us. And that was when my research question really started to come into play. How do the ongoing challenges of the Canadian housing crisis impact United Church ministers of Canada in their search for a call to ministry and home? So what I chose to do was to go to the clergy, specifically and ask, how has the housing crisis impacted your ability to follow that sense of call? The specific study took the shape of a phenomenological study about those lived experiences, the vulnerabilities. What are their safety and financial responsibilities? And how is their call being impacted? What is the experience of being clergy in finding a place to call your home? And my participants, for the purpose of the study, will be known by the pseudonyms Matthew, Mark, and Luke. I like themed names, and as my pronouns identified with he, him pronouns, I went for those. And so I asked them to share some of the experiences, stories, and insights that they have and how the housing crisis is affecting them as clergy in the United Church of Canada. They shared their lived experiences of searching for a call in the housing crisis since 2021. And 3 key themes arose. Home defined. How are our clergy experiencing a sense of home in their ministries? What is home for clergy in the United Church of Canada? The second is the toll that it takes. What is the impact on our clergy? What experiences are they having, and how has this shaped them physically, psychologically, emotionally, and spiritually? And finally, we look at this covenant of care and how it is impacted by the relational nature of ministry. How do we respond to one another as congregations, clergy, in the wider church? How are we responding to the crisis relationally? And how is our treatment of one another reflective of the covenantal relationships we have with God? How do we define home? If I were to ask you, a crowd here sitting, where is home? Is there a particular saying that comes to your mind? Home is where the heart is. And this seemed to be the same response on the hearts and minds of the clergy I interviewed. At the core for each, their feeling of home was tied to an ability to bring family with them, or the ability to establish friends outside and within the relations developed within the confines of that ministry. And so Mark had shared, home is where the family is. And he went on to say that a manse doesn't necessarily feel like your own home, and each participant spoke to some degree about the unique experiences of living in a manse as opposed to homeowning. But Mark did say, for me, as long as my wife's here, as long as my children can come here, that's home. Luke shared living in a variety of places throughout his ministry, but he said the one thing that is constant is our family. And he actually referenced the old Greek saying, home is where your heart is. Home is where your family is. On the one hand, home is a roof over your head, but on the other hand, it's the people. That's what's most important. And Matthew spoke to those outer relationships saying, I think it's where you feel a sense of connection, where you are rooted in the neighborhood that you're in, and you are able to create a life out of it that is irrespective of the work that brought you there in the first place. Each interviewee, while sharing their experience of searching during the housing crisis, spoke how moving's not unfamiliar for clergy. Each had moved multiple times at varying frequencies and durations. Each had spent time in more than one manse. And the sharing of discussion around manses was always that they came with other issues or considerations, but each participant said that relocating to somewhere with a manse was easier. And a nature of transience was revealed in these interviews. Luke had referenced earlier being in a wide variety of places. Matthew even quoted the movie The Godfather. It's the business we've chosen. He spoke further to say, you feel like you're constantly starting over again. And even though I'm not out of practice with moving from place to place, I've never been entirely comfortable with it. I like to take the time to get to know people and vice versa, and at least obtain a core group of friends that may or may not exist within the church itself. And that is not always the easiest thing to obtain, but that's by the virtue of the profession that I have, where you have to have boundaries in certain things that a certain definition of friends can't really cultivate. Mark did not have as much to say on the frequency of moving, but had referenced more than 2 moves in under 2 decades. When it came to what is home, I think Luke said it best. He thinks it's a very important issue because we're facing a housing issue. What is the minister dealing with? Because you want to be in ministry. You want calling. You also want home, or something like home. So how can you have that if, as Jody said, it's not even practically possible? The next is the toll of searching, and I think my little friend there sums it up pretty good. The process of searching for ministry with housing as the key factor was way more involved than I had previously considered, despite moving myself from a rental to a manse. Each person shared the very unique aspects, and each participant would have had to go through a similar step process to establish a new ministry in a community of faith. And now the search process in the United Church of Canada is a process referred to as call and appointment. Previously, many of our first congregations were chosen through the transfer and settlement process, but we've been moving away from that starting about 16 years ago. But in the call and appointment process, clergy are responsible for using an online service called Church Hub. And I think many of you in the room might agree with me when you compare it to online dating. So you chat, you meet, you get together and see if you feel that sense. But what you're looking for is a sense of call to ministry. Then you move to your negotiations. The contract is hopefully agreed upon, and it is brought to a congregational meeting to be voted on and then sent to the region for approval. And when you know, as the clergy person, that there is going to be a congregational meeting, that is usually around the time when you try to give your congregation notice. There can be set timeframes around this, but each circumstance is very situational. And so all this is to happen. And you sure hope it all goes according to plan. But there's so much more than meets the eye in this process. Each participant shared unique aspects of this, which painted a very busy picture for the experience. And the general experience for housing for these clergy, I feel, can be likened to the weariness and tiredness of the Israelites in the book of Exodus, wandering through the desert. There is the vastness before you, and there is little more you can do at times than lift your hands to God and ask for help. Luke had mentioned how you start by staring into the darkness, and anything is helpful. Any little bit of light that comes through is hopeful that you can find a place. And he shared the transitional aspects of searching for home. He said it could be a challenge because on the one hand, you're saying goodbye to your old church, and you have that whole process, which takes a lot of pastoral energy. And you also might get a final funeral in there. You can never tell. But at the same time, you're dealing with competition in the housing market, and you might not be able to travel that couple 100 kilometers and go see the place in person. And so, you know, the realtor does the walkthrough and they take a nice video for you and you put your faith in that. And you're dealing with a bank and every other part of moving at the same time. And it's a lot different when you're renting, he said. You have it much easier. There are challenges, but it's a dual reality you grapple with. It's much simpler when you're saying goodbye to one place, preparing for the next, and housing isn't an issue because you're moving from one manse to the next. Now, housing is a third part of the process, which is so challenging, so scary, and so daring. Luke said, I think a lot of people might just say, I'm not even going to go further. Mark shared multiple experiences of just how these negotiations go. After requesting a wage which would give him the flexibility to purchase a home and eat, they countered multiple times with lower salaries. And then came radio silence from this congregation, only to find out that they were now voting on a new minister. The second experience was not much different. When the congregation could not offer a wage that would allow buying in a home in the area, given that the prices had skyrocketed. He went on to say that it often feels like you're up against a wall. Matthew spoke in depth on the logistics of moving. He said the unpacking of it all is a pain in the butt. It really is. And maybe some see it as a conflict of interest or getting in too much into your personal space to help you unpack. But the offer is appreciated regardless. He went on to say, my health isn't what it once was, and the physical nature of moving is becoming more and more challenging. When you get estimates from moving companies, they give you a number of scenarios. And it's beneficial if the church has enough latitude in the budget to allow for various combinations of what you would need to move. He asked, how much have you budgeted? And how far can I go without breaking the bank? He went on to describe that in a 5-year range, this is pre-2021 and post, moving costs have doubled for moving companies. And other considerations that he shared were, what happens when your congregation can no longer afford you and the bottom falls out? What happens when your partner needs employment? The really big issue on many Canadians' heart is, how do you find a medical practitioner, a veterinarian? And can you even scout the property beforehand when your travel funds are low? And what I really noticed from each of these participants while sharing this was an utter sense of exhaustion, even though the process was in the rearview mirror. Luke shared that it adds to the amount of energy required to make you transition your call. Because the new church, they're waiting for you. They're waiting for that amazing first Sunday where you bring them together and they feel, our ministers arrived. And even that requires a lot of energy. So it's costly. And I think that new reality we're dealing with is costly at a time when ministers are already, many of them, on the edge emotionally and psychologically. It's costly to make a move now in terms of housing and call. It's costly, he said, emotionally, psychologically, financially. I mean, it's costly in terms of risk factor because you're tied to a congregation. And if that congregation has a 3 or 4 year lifespan on the books financially, and beyond that, it's a dark tunnel, you're going to feel a lot less ready. And Mark spoke on the deeply painful parts of the process and how it had taken its toll on him. He said there was a point about a year ago when things started to fall apart with one of the congregations, and I felt a strong urge to just pack it up and leave. I was close to calling my doctor and getting some sort of leave. I was feeling the stress and the frustration building. Instead, what I did was I took a week of vacation, and a week of isolation made a world of a difference. I needed to be practicing self-care, even if it meant that I spent my birthday all by myself. I went through wanting to leave the denomination, wanting to leave ministry as a whole, and wanting to dig in and fight. I felt the stress. I felt pressured. I felt like the church was asking me to sacrifice my family to be a minister, which I was unwilling to do. It's incredibly important to me. I felt it all. In the article, American Lutheran Pastors and Their Finances by Mark A. Grenquist, he revealed a similar picture to the experiences we're having here in the United Church of Canada. The state of affairs impacts a church ability to pay the minister. When the churches are also experiencing economic difficulties due to the state of the economy, the jobs may start switching from full-time to partially funded ministry. And they move away from manses. And this has been happening since the 70s. The unpredictability of the increase in housing costs was unpredictable. And it's now become a downside for some churches, and it strongly affects clergy finances and mobility. We move into this covenant of care. Reverend Dr. Rob Fell, in his article on ordination for Touchstone magazine, said, it's a shared ministry. The specific offering of the Spirit's gift through ordained ministry, and in light of its own needs and expectations, the church commits to pray for its ministers, support them, and love them, and pay them a living wage that responsibly provides for them and their dependents. These forms of support are expressions of the faith community's recognition that a minister's service is important enough that she or he ought to be released from needing to earn money another way. However, this relationship that we start off with is not always begun with a concept of a covenant in mind. It is often of a job and an employer. And I spoke of the toll of this previously. An aspect of this was the ongoing struggle over salary, given housing in the area, and how the minister is expected to make ends meet. Each of these clergy members spoke extensively about the growing costs of moving, and both Matthew and Mark spoke extensively about the experiences of negotiating salaries and how often this has brought on immense tension. These clergy, however, lamented they could not go to an area if they could not afford it, even if they had a feeling of call towards that place. Luke shared an experience of his call to ministry where he ended up staying with his family in a motel for months. And this was before the housing crisis. But the comment which continues to bring a weighted silence in my heart was that you've got to pay me enough to live, or else I'm going to end up at the food bank you support. In 1 Kings chapter 17, verses 7 to 24, Elijah is summoned by God to go to Zarephath. And there he meets a widow whom God has called to provide food for him during his time there. And she, as a widow, had feared she would not be able to provide. But she was already struggling to provide for herself and her son. But Elijah assured her. And her jar of oil and her bag of flour continued to provide for the three of them into his ministry, and it did not run out. Much like our ministries, it can be absolutely terrifying to enter the covenant, even when you are called by God. But ensuring that the people who come to offer their gifts of ministry are provided for, the community of faith is in turn provided for. When the relationship fulfills this covenant we establish together, this model of a covenant is built in reflection of the covenant we have with God, a covenant of care. We care for God's people and God's world, as God always cares for us. We live into relationship with one another as we live into relationship with God. And it goes beyond this first covenant. As Reverend Dr. Rob Fennell puts in the previously mentioned Touchstone article, it is also a thank offering to God in gratitude for God's provision of these leaders in our midst, for those who can make the sacrifices necessary to serve the church as ordained minister, whose selves embody a fullness with their Christian vocation for lower pay than most others with their education will earn, who place service to others at the highest premium for spending their life's energy. We give God thanks. The clergy I spoke with recognized these covenants. And one of the best things about this was the great sense of gratitude they shared for the hospitality and welcome of the churches that they were able to go to. Mark had said, "They take good care of us. We showed up and there was a fridge full of food and baked goods on the counter the day we moved in. And we get regular deliveries of biscuits and jams and other things. It's a place where we feel appreciated." And as someone who never leaves a UCW event without an armful of food, that appreciation means everything. Each clergy was grateful for their current communities and caring for them, providing manses or helping in the search for housing, and every bit of effort was met with gratitude. But this brings us to the question, what can I do? The question feels like it's towering over us. But I've come away with some helpful advice in the space of a really difficult situation. The search process for some churches, for some clergy, can feel endless. And so here are some practical things answering the question, what can I do? Starting with the wider church, we have to start facilitating deep conversations. How do we talk about this covenant of ministry together? Why are people called to the order of ministry, and how can we support these gifts? What value do we place on ministry other than seeing people in the pews? What does flourishing ministry look like? And how do we continue to be called to honor the work of the Holy Spirit in the search process, which connects ministry leadership with communities of faith? If money insecurity is a real fear for our communities of faith, we need to address that fear and find ways to foster positive relationships around money and productive dialogues. And it's time to rethink clergy housing. If we as a denomination have structured this process to encourage clergy to be able to build equity for things like retirement, family, utility assets like a home, and a safety net for life's most unpredictable expenses, what barriers are in the way that we as a denomination can remove? We need to ask what percent are clergy spending on their housing? Will clergy benefit more from utilizing tax-free saving accounts and registered retirement savings plans when they're staying in a manse than fighting it out in the housing market? How much based on our earnings should each clergy person be able to put away for their personal savings? Each of my participants voiced the concern which I live with every day, the bias in which I enter this study with. If the new average homeowner age is 36 and increasing, young clergy cannot afford home. We have and could have more ordered clergy in their early 20s. How will we house them? But young clergy are not the only marginalized in the housing market. There are so many. My help for our congregations that some of my interviewees had revealed would be to thoroughly consider selling the manse. Although selling in a seller's market might seem like an advantage, when there is little to no affordable housing in your area, it places you at a huge disadvantage. And if the minister doesn't wish to use the manse, have a discussion on rentals to help with the costs. Before the interview, research housing in your area. What does it look like economically for a minister to live in your area? Does your salary leave room for a living comfortable life and not just scraping by? Having the research in the interview can make the process less stressful. And ask yourself, who is helpful in this situation in our community of faith? Who are your people? Do you have realtors, connections to medical practitioners, movers with trucks, willing unpackers? Who is your welcome crew? And what are your resources? Can your community of faith offer a loan to the minister to make a down payment? Or can the salary be raised even when it feels like you might be taking a risk? Talk to your regional representatives and see what resources might be available. And think beyond the move. How will your community of faith continue to care for that minister? How can you cut the cost of living in your area for that person? It might help to sit down and with a pencil and paper and make a list of what can we bring and how can they be sustained in sharing their gifts. And for my clergy, talk to your fellow clergy. I think I don't have to reiterate that after our first two presentations. Two participants shared how important those groups were to them, how a circle of prayer and confidential trust of people with similar experiences made a huge difference. What are your resources? Which people in the church do you know who are well connected that you can speak to? The Bermuda Nova Scotia Regional Council has a clergy association. Who can support you in your region? And is there a gap that needs to be filled? Keep communicating with the region, or discern what regional committees you might be able to connect with. And if you have time, why not join one? Take it on yourself. And I know we're all tired of hearing this phrase, but self-care, you need it, even if it feels like everything will fall apart. Things will turn out all right in the end, because you need to take that space. Open up about your feelings. Talk to a licensed professional about the stress you're under. And clergy also have to be responsible for and about their finances. And one of the best ways we can help clergy with this is to keep them informed, to make use of retirement resources out there. Because even saving with a manse is doable by having retirement and saving plans for ministers. There are workshops available. I'll throw out the name of the organization, ACPM, the Association of Canadian Pension Management. They offer free online courses on retirement planning, and they are extremely beneficial. Our own church offers regular pension seminars, and there is always strength in speaking to a licensed professional that you can trust on how to handle money. As hard as it can be, it will benefit you. There is so much that needs to be done, and I have merely scratched the surface. But we ask, how do we respond to the housing crisis? How can we embrace this covenantal relationship with one another? It starts by shaping that question. What can I do? Thank you. I'll quickly jump in with my thanks. I am exceptionally grateful for my participants for sharing their experiences openly and vulnerably. And for the many, I will attempt all of your titles. Reverend Betsy Hogan, Reverend Dr. Rob Fennell, Reverend David Hewitt, Reverend Dr. Ross Bartlett, Reverend Dr. Susan McAlpine-Gillis, and our library for their expertise and support. And for the Reverend Kin, Dr. Jody Clark, and my friends and classmates for every piece of feedback, support, and prayer through the ups and the downs. And of course, my devoted family, who by now might be able to recite some of my presentation. And thank you all for being here today.
Good, okay, thank you. Comments, questions, thoughts? Go, okay, just a second, I'll go there.
Thank you, Katie. Very interesting. And from a research perspective, it was very helpful that you limited it to one denomination so that you could just focus on the intricacies of that. Not being part of that denomination, though, my family are dual citizens in the Roman Catholic Church and Baptist Church. And so we have very different perspectives, both in our church experiences and different ways that housing is handled. We just hired a minister at my Baptist church in August. We don't have a man's. It's in rural Nova Scotia where there might be 2 houses for sale within, a 15-minute drive. That became a challenge for the minister and his family and for the congregation. So I resonate a lot with that. That being said, then there are other, I think of rectories and Catholic priests who move, but might also have, different moving needs based on their situations. So I'm wondering what spillover you might see to other groups that, or other traditions that deal with housing and moves and all of that stuff differently.
It's interesting. In each person I spoke to that was in a different denomination, everybody had a different structure of how they house their clergy. And we all come away with growing pains, I think, from it. We're all trying to improve these the best we can, and we make wrong choices all the time. But as we continue to navigate the housing crisis, I think one of the most important parts is asking ourselves what value we place on ministry. And unfortunately, it's a hard question to ask because there is so much more that goes to it. But I think as our many ecumenical denominations start to wrestle with these ideas, we need to ask the importance of ordered ministry in our churches. Why are we providing shelter and housing for these folks who are offering their gifts? And I think this is a relevant question in every situation. When we ask, how much money can we spend? Or do we continue to offer a home? Or what do we do in this situation? I think it boils down to we got to do something, because ministry is there for each of us. It provides that care. So I'm hoping I've answered this. Okay. Yeah.
Hey, Katie. A couple of my colleagues have ended up needing to find a place quickly when they moved to a new community of faith and settled for renting space from parishioners, which is kind of a muddy ethical situation to be in when you are both their minister and they're your landlord. So I'm wondering if you have any comments on those kind of situations, any guidance in those, if those could work, or if they're always going to be a mess.
It's a really important question. I can't speak to any of my participants' experiences with that particular situation, but I was offered a situation like this in my last charge. Although I had a great relationship with that person, I also recognized that I never wanted us to have to wrestle with that relationship because of that housing situation. So I did look elsewhere. It was a smaller apartment that I ended up renting. But I think rentals in general are a really hard way to live in ministry. It seemed from my conversations with my participants that rentals were the most unaffordable option. And it is placing a ton of strain on clergy finances. One of my participants is renting currently, and it is a consistent hunt for housing to get out of that rental situation. As it's not a bad rental situation, but it is very expensive.
Hi, Katie. It was a privilege to be your classmate this year and to see you work through this process, how it all unfolded for you. And I know that at one point, you were looking for particular research and it was very hard to find. So I'm wondering how do you see this research, this body of work that you've created? How are you hoping that might be used in the future to add to this knowledge base?
Well, thank you. We are in the process of reevaluating our governance systems in the United Church of Canada. I think this is the best time for us to really ask those questions. What are we doing structurally and how is that impacting clergy? I think when it comes down to trying to find the research, what I found the most help in having one-on-one conversations with people, because the experience, it feels, was only just starting to get put on paper for the United Church. There's been housing dilemmas written for a long period of time throughout church history, but for many of us, it was hard to find exactly talking about this brand new housing crisis we've been experiencing and what I will refer to in quotation marks as a post-COVID era. But we continue to try and figure out what are we doing. And I think my hope is that I'm hoping a couple of my regional folks who I threw my presentation at are able to bring this with them. I'm grateful that I had a number of folks with our region who I got to speak to about this process I've gone through, and they were really good in offering an ear. And so I hope this takes flight. That is my real big hope for our church.
Any other questions? A couple of comments online while you're thinking about questions. So Catherine points out housing is a major concern today for the church, for clergy, for our members, for their loved ones, and also all who also face uncertainty of having a safe home and food on the table.
Yeah, we're all facing it. We're all experiencing this constant insecurity. CBC News recently published an article saying that 65% of Nova Scotians this year alone have experienced trouble with housing, just housing. I think that illuminates just what we're looking at across the province, especially given that Nova Scotia's housing rate is not even the worst that we're looking at. They have a fun little map on the Government of Canada website where you can see housing rates. I say fun, it's not fun.
Yeah. Another question, have you seen within regions, have you seen any changes with regard to housing?
Well, I'll be honest, I have not been in the United Church as long as some of my colleagues who have definitely seen the transformation of our models of housing throughout the years. I referenced, of course, we saw a big shift in the 70s when we began to move away from this manse model that we had. And you can see a start in our manuals in about the 60s and 70s when the conversation started developing on housing. And then we started to transition our placements. We went from a transfer and settlement process, which there was a lot of debate around, and we've moved into a call and appointment. So this approach to housing seems to be constantly under development. And the United Church of Canada is actually doing a lot of research based on the justice rights of housing. And we see a number of churches that have dedicated their whole sanctuaries and churches to building affordable housing. But I'm not seeing as much for clergy other than what was put forth at the regional meeting. So I'm optimistic, but nervous.
Susan and Rob. Susan and Rob.
Thanks, Katie, because I think this is a really important thing for us to be thinking about. My question kind of goes back to something you said early on about your own experience when you were looking for your SME site. And there were 4 pastoral charges that you considered, but two did not have a manse. And so you opted for the pastoral charge with the manse. And I'm wondering if both for yourself or any of your participants, if you had a sense that your call was more dictated by the housing that was available than by the sense of the Spirit and maybe the complexities of the pastoral relationship. Like, do you think you might have fit in one of those other places, but felt you couldn't say yes to the Spirit calling you there because housing was such a difficulty?
It's a great question. It didn't come up as much in the interviews as I had anticipated, but it showed up in very implicit ways. One of the conversations that was had was that the participants shared that they were looking for a place to go, and that when everything started to fall into place, housing-wise, it felt like God affirming that call. When things start to align and the stars kind of come into the right zone, for some, that was affirmation of a call, of that initial inkling. But I think for myself, when I experienced this process and I was navigating my own sense of call, you would show up. And the moment you brought up housing, it almost disrupted everything. And so it's almost as if the relationship kind of cracked a little bit in that interview, because the conversation turned in a different direction. We could no longer focus on their beautiful ministry that they were working towards. I heard no more of that. I could only hear that block of, I can't live here. And so I think it is absolutely impacting our ability to follow our sense of call. It's definitely impacted mine. And I know for several of my participants, when they spoke of it, they said, I started to feel things. But the second that we started arguing about salary, the second that they told me they could not give me enough to buy a house and food, I couldn't. And so housing seems to be cracking it at the edges. And I think it's really something important we need to consider.
Thanks, Katie. Great presentation. A couple of notes. One is that one of the features of the Canadian housing market is that we have felt pressure due to the rise in income properties, particularly vacation rentals. And I will out myself as a person who's availed myself of those income properties in terms of having vacations. I don't own one. But that has put a squeeze. So one of the questions is, of course, my own, ethical participation in that. And secondly, what does my church, our church, what do Christians say into an economy that, of course, is largely a free market economy, and yet we have encouraged this kind of squeeze on housing in general. By having these income properties as a way of making income, but reducing the actual housing inventory available to people who need a place to live. So that's a question. Like, how does the church respond to that? The second question I have for you is whether it came up in your research or whether you've thought about cooperative housing and co-op housing and co-housing. I know one.
Alvin Burt wrote on cooperative housing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know one minister in a Canadian city who is actively sharing a home, a large rambling home with people who are not church people, just a great place to live. She likes that. And so the third question is sort of like, can we encourage co-op housing with the many, many rambling, huge houses, urban and rural in Canada, as kind of a normative response of human beings actually craving community, but also needing a place to live that isn't, a rotten place to live. So lucky you, 3 questions.
I think I can work with that. So what we're wrestling with here is a real big tension between this value on capitalism that we have placed in society. We have that very weighted value of buying your first home, of being able to afford a cottage. And so when you have those things, that for many is a symbol of success in life. And then we have the tension for us as Christians when we are thinking of our scriptures, when Jesus said, pointing to the widow saying, give all that you have. This is an ongoing tension that we're going to have to continue to navigate. Unfortunately, I don't have an answer for each of us on how we navigate those tensions, but I do encourage giving. One of the hardest conversations we have with our churches is about stewardship and what it means to give. Roger James, my conversations with our regional representative for stewardship, spoke of giving as a spiritual practice and how the more that we give spiritually, how it can strengthen those relationships we have with God and with one another. I think cooperative housing is a great idea in theory. I know we have things to work out, but I think we have that with almost every situation of housing. We have things to work on. I was doing my undergrad at St. Mary's for years, and those dorms are very much cooperative housing. You are sharing this space with many other people. And we all come together each summer. I haven't stayed on campus, but I listened to the many hearts and stories from my classmates of sharing that space. And when you figure out a groove, when the accommodations are suitable, and when you build those relationships with one another, those situations can be fruitful and they can be thriving. I think cooperative housing is absolutely one of the solutions we need to take a look at. And as many of our congregations have these big, beautiful homes, and some of them are living alone in these homes, cooperative housing is a great step forward. My last apartment was only made available because of a new widow who didn't want to live alone. And so we moved in together, and we still play Scrabble together online every day. So these are those steps into building relationship and covenant with one another.
We're gonna have to cut this section off here. You're getting a lot of traffic online. Okay, good. Lots of people living in tents apparently in ministry. This is a comment from Sonia. This is a comment she opens. You touched on our reality, being in southwestern Ontario, and also dual citizens in the Presbyterian and United churches as a clergy couple. My husband and I have had to weigh calls, appointments with or without manses, and decided it needed to be one with a manse. To afford a home in the present housing market, we would need to live an hour away to be affordable. And that did not seem beneficial to ministry and connection. But I know many clergy who have had to do this, and that creates a new dilemma in ministry and connection. Then there's the reality, as you said, as a covenant of care. One manse was not well maintained, and that impacted our family. The current one is such a great blessing, and the congregation is committed to man's care, which translates to a deeper sense of care for us as a family. Any comments? Make sense?
Absolutely. Well, I live in manse, and so I've been grateful every single day for the care that my manse has received. But for a while, that manse, it was hard to keep up on the care. And now we're in the process of upgrading some things, of working through these complications together and trying to make it a livable space. And I think what happens is when you start communicating with one another, you really need to communicate that your situation is not livable. And if it is not responded to with a, oh no, what do we do? Then that's a really important thing for you to consider in pursuing your ministry together. Because if there is not a willingness to care, how are you going to be sustained while you care for them? So there's so much more on clergy couples needing manses, commutes that wear on our heart and soul, and making sure that our mileage is adequately provided for as well. But these are all considerations we need to take into account when we find housing. So.
Can I go on with one other final question? Unfortunately, I can't honor all the questions being posed online, so maybe you can look at them later. It's in the chat and respond individually. But here's just another question. Tangent, I mean, it's certainly consistent with what we're looking at. What impact does the housing situation of ministers have on their public image and trust within the community?
That is really hard. Because for many clergy, you want to have that image of, I've got it all together. But when your housing starts falling apart beneath you, you don't. And that amount of stress and strain on your very well-being can drag you to some pretty dark places. And I think as ministers, being able to serve when we're dealing with those dark places is exceptionally difficult. We no longer are able to bring our best selves when housing is not there for us. We are no longer able to offer the same degree of care that we would if we were provided for. And you try and provide. It's this very beautiful reciprocal relationship that we really strive for. It doesn't always happen as we hope it does. And there are plenty of bumps and bruises along the way. But that is what we're looking to do in ministry, is to build that relationship of care for one another.
Cool. Katie, we are gonna have to stop. No, seriously, but so I want to say a couple things, just check our time. Yeah, let's almost 2 hours. You did a really great job. Well done. So we're gonna break until 1:30. So we're gonna reassemble at 1:30. But before I do that, at the end of every class, right? I would always, at the end of every student talking about their thing, I'd say, that's hot, right? Like that is hot. And as a researcher, I say, keep hot. It's going to be in your belly. You got to feel it. And if it's a hot thing, people are going to resonate with it. They're going to get excited about it. We've had 3 extraordinary adventures today, all of which have created heat for us, points of consideration, ways of looking at church, reforming how we see church, how we live as church. And each presentation today has challenged us. Yours has challenged us to look at a really fundamental reality. How do we live? How do we house clergy? How do we honor this vocation that we have? That we're not going to be made rich. Like I told people a long time ago, I'm not going to be made wealthy through this in the physical sense. In the spiritual sense, cute. Except if you can't afford to take your kids on vacation, it's not that cute, right? It's a real tension and a real opportunity for dialogue with congregations. And it encouraged us to do that. Katie, you took us on that adventure in many, many ways. So Katie, thank you so much. Well done.